Die enigste manier hoe ons die vrot en die rot kan stop in Eskom is om hom onmiddellik onder administrasie te plaas. Want hy, sy, wat ook al jy Eskom of in Kaapstad, sy, Eskom is bankrupt, hy's moertoe, hy is klaar, hy kan nie meer geld suig uit ons as die belastingbetaler nie.
Hello South Africa. I started recording this podcast last Sunday. I had it ready for release that same evening as a voice note but decided only to release it as a video during the following week. During that time, so much happened that led to wholesale changes to my original draft. However, I had to remind myself why I made the original podcast. I reminded myself the original video was to sound the alarm about Neil de Beer's plan for Eskom. This plan will harm Eskom and threaten the country as a whole. Through this video, I will also directly speak to two individuals. I really hope they will take heed of the message contained here. Without sounding overly dramatic, South Africa faces its greatest challenge, and it appears few of us have a proper understanding of what is really happening. I decided to make this video to shed more light on the current events at Eskom. I am convinced that Mr. de Beer's court action will do more harm than good. He will not fix Eskom. Instead, he will destroy a critical public utility. Give me half an hour of your time, and I guarantee your understanding of the Eskom crisis will be much sharper. Let's talk about why Neil de Beer's plan will not fix Eskom. In a recent podcast, the Russell Report exposed the dark counter-narrative that drives the current electricity and load-shedding crisis in South Africa. More recently, the Russell Report shared with you the plan by Neil de Beer of the United Independent Movement to file court papers in the coming weeks to have Eskom declared insolvent. In a live stream video on Facebook, Mr. de Beer announced that he is busy assembling a massive team to serve papers on Eskom and NERSA to declare the power utility bankrupt. In the next 2 weeks, they will file papers with the courts to have Eskom placed under business rescue and full administration. According to de Beer, more than 8 political parties and institutions will join the UIM in this initiative. They are also in discussion with 3 other parties in joining their suit. De Beer is confident these parties will sign up. In his video, he discloses the names of 3 parties. The first is the Cape Independent Party of Jack Miller. The second is the Cape Coloured Congress of Fordale Adams. And the third is the ULA of Hein Marx. During our podcast on January 13th, we shared with you a plan concocted by an international group that ends eerily similar to the plan of Mr. de Beer. According to this Rothschild plan, they would succeed in stealing Eskom if they could scale 3 hurdles. Firstly, they had to convince Eskom's creditors that the power utility is no longer a true going concern under its current legal, operational, and governance structure because it has devolved into an operationally dysfunctional, financially insolvent, unreliable, and corrupt entity. A damaging audit report by Deloitte and Touche towards the end of last year has basically confirmed that the power utility is no longer a going concern. However, despite corruption at Eskom, the true nature of this graft remains concealed. The Russell Report revealed to its listeners how the Eskom CEO, Andre de Ruyter, was implicated in corruption and how he resigned before being fired by the board. However, he is allowed to work out his notice period instead of being suspended until the investigation into his corrupt activities is finalized. Can anyone please explain that to me? Why do Mr. de Beer, Jack Miller, Fordale Adams and Hein Marx not instead concern themselves with the corruption and incompetence of de Ruyter? Why are they targeting the people's most valued asset instead? Secondly, they have also convinced creditors that Eskom's baseload generation fleet, transmission, and distribution systems are so severely damaged that nothing can be done to save it. The ongoing Stage 6 blackouts are further part of the scheme to convince people that the utility is completely dysfunctional and beyond repair. This is one giant hoax perpetrated on the South African people. Finally, they must also manufacture the consent of South Africans. This is where Mr. de Beer and his collaborators come in. According to de Beer, the South African people are ready to give their consent. Everyone has now seen the light and is following the UIM.
2 weeks ago, I announced that the UIM will be building a team, a massive team, where we will be serving papers on Eskom and NERSA. I'd like to update you in finality on that. Again, God has provided. He just provides. We are blessed with our Vader. Vra en daar sal geantwoord word. Klop en daar sal oopgemaak word. Dit is wat ek gedoen het. And I can tell you overwhelmingly today that more than 8 political parties and institutions as of today have now decided to join the UIM as co-counsel on the march to serve the documents to Eskom. And I want to say to them, to the CIP, the CCC, the ULA, currently we are discussing with 3 other parties, and by end of next week they will also be part. I want to thank David Lipchitz, our current lead energy expert on this team. I want to sincerely now thank Advocate Yassim Mohammed of being lead counsel. I want to thank every person participating now in building a team to take on, not fight with Eskom, but to demand that Eskom be put under business rescue and full administration. That's my view. Die enigste manier hoe ons die vrot en die rot kan stop in Eskom is om hom onmiddellik onder administrasie te plaas. Want hy, sy, wat ook al jy Eskom of in Kaapstad, sy, Eskom is bankrot, hy is moertoe, hy is klaar, hy kan nie meer geld suig uit ons as die belastingbetaler nie. En die enigste manier om dit te stop is om hulle te stop onder administrasie, en die mense het nou gesien, uiteindelik het hulle gepop, Neil de Beer, dit is wat jy wil doen, ja, dit is wat ek wil doen. And now that everybody knows, we are fighting to place Eskom under administration. Now they're joining us. Why? Because it is the right way to go, South Africa. You can't keep on bailing water when there's a hole in the ship. Plug the hole. Hoor julle my? Moenie aan mekaar sit in 'n bootjie en die water uitskep want daar's 'n gat in die romp. Plak die gat. Stop die gat. Dan is daar nie meer water om uit te skep nie. Om Eskom bankrot te verklaar en om onder administrasie te plaas is die eerste stap wat almal nou volg vir die UIM. Almal nou. Want ons het dit gesien. Die tweede, nadat ons hulle bankrot verklaar het en onder administrasie sit, waar hulle nie meer kan steel, waar hulle nie meer kan sabotage nie, is dan om 'n wet toe te laat, en ons gaan die hoforder kry, dat ons as mens in hierdie land, as persoon of maatskappy of organisasie, ons eie krag, sonder bureaukrasie of rooi typ, dat ons dit kan opwek. Dames en here, dit is my saak, ek het daai saak gestel, en onomwonde het hierdie land se mense gesê, dit is nou wat reg is. Ja, hierdie klein partytjie het die grootste deurbraak in lig gemaak. Ons het nie gaan march nie, ons het nie gaan protesteer nie, ons het nie gaan plakkate nie, ons vat hulle hof toe, binne die volgende 6 weke. En kyk hoe ons nou gegroei, en kyk hoe kom mense en staan nou by hierdie klein lokomotief en sê, kan ons aanhak, meneer? Sekerlik.
Mr. De Beer, I don't think every South African will be hooking onto your locomotive to become complicit in the biggest heist of a South African state-owned enterprise. This heist will dwarf the theft of South African Airways. The theft of the power utility can completely deindustrialize the economy and depopulate the country as millions starve to death. Imagine the hubris and vanity of a man claiming he can save a country by destroying its sole source of base-load electricity. So how is he proposing for this to happen? De Beer suggests that you stop buying the utilities' electricity and that NERSA start dishing out licenses left, right, and center so anyone can produce electricity and sell it to the people. Do you understand what this madman is saying? He is saying that potentially every South African has the technology and the means to generate their own electricity and that all we need to do is to acquire the licensing rights. When you install rooftop solar, you are buying someone else's intellectual property. Unless you design and manufacture your own solar devices, you are making someone else rich. Where does he get that idea from? My poor family cannot survive on our little, and now this man wants to tell me that I must invest hundreds of thousands of rands in purchasing somebody else's technology to have electricity in my house. Does Mr. De Beer know that China controls 95% of this market and that ANC cadres have shares in these Chinese companies? Let me share with you some facts about rooftop solar. The rooftop solar that people such as Mr. De Beer are so convinced about is a Trojan horse. It is the enemy which people unwittingly allow into their lives as an assurance policy against an unreliable Eskom and load shedding, but it is the very same thing that will ultimately lead to the demise of the power utility. It is something of a catch-22. According to the Technavio website, the solar energy market share in South Africa is expected to increase by 23.3 terawatt-hour units from 2021 to 2026, and the market's growth momentum will accelerate at a compound annual growth rate of 29.7%. The expectation is that the continued load shedding will fuel this growth. This whole notion of enabling businesses and households to invest in rooftop solar is just a means of exploiting a crisis that they themselves have created and will continue for as long as it can be exploited for gain. Investment by households in rooftop solar will only come at great expense, and most households are already excluded from this market. A Frontiers in Sustainable Cities study describes the rooftop solar uptake in sunny South Africa as pitiful. The researchers cite as reasons because rooftop PV is expensive in part due to costly batteries and inverters, but also as support measures such as feed-in tariff funding, tax rebates and subsidies are non-existent. It will only drive these households into energy poverty as they struggle to find workable alternatives to the unreliable supply. South Africa. Those predictions by politicians and corrupt Eskom management that load shedding will end in 2 or 3 years have nothing to do with resolving technical issues. These estimates are based on 2 considerations. One is the time it will take to roll out the projects of the independent power producers. And 2, the forecast made by business actuaries who calculated how much time these solar companies require to maximize their profit with rooftop solar. The truth about load shedding is it will continue until 2026 and beyond. Are you awake yet, South Africa? The problems at Eskom are complex. However, there was one simple way to accelerate the demise of the power utility. Prevent it from selling its primary product, that is electricity. Imagine that you are an egg vendor. Your business is selling eggs, and its profitability depends on you moving as much product. Every time a client comes to buy eggs, you encourage that client to go to the poultry farm and buy chickens that will lay eggs. Every client who walks away and decides to follow your advice immediately sees the financial benefit of owning chickens. This is what they are doing to Eskom. They are starving it of its income. In 2022 there were 197 days of load shedding. 197 days of reduced income. As a result of this, the utility is unable to generate enough revenue. With the projected increase in load shedding for 2023, they estimate a further loss of 20 billion rand. Also, by 2026 the demand for Eskom electricity will be down by 23.31 terawatt-hour units if the Technavio projections are correct. Eskom stands no chance against this criminal syndicate. What I will be sharing now is the real deception. Mr. De Beer and his legal team are either ignorant or complicit in a diabolical plot. The jury is still out on this one. But what Mr. De Beer is telling South Africans is that once Eskom is placed under liquidation, the courts will place the utility in the curatorship of the South African people. That statement is one big fat lie. The courts will place it in curatorship for the creditors' benefit, not the people's. In the podcast of January 13th, we explain what will happen to Eskom once this process is initiated. For the benefit of our listeners, we will briefly describe the process outlined by KW Miller of CIO Advisors. To start off, Eskom is to be placed under the control of a new hands-on senior energy CIO and a new independent senior energy executive management team. An auditor's report found evidence of failure by the utility to comply with the Public Finance Management Act, Eskom said in a stock exchange filing. According to the filing, Deloitte had found that there was a material uncertainty relating to Eskom's ability to continue as a going concern. In this regard, CIO Advisors has already requested all creditors to send their confidential statements of holdings and willingness to support the ARV, or Asset Recovery Vehicle. According to CIO Advisors, gaining creditors' consent is the first step required to begin the restructuring of Eskom, which is financially and operationally insolvent. Eskom is about to be declared a bankrupt entity and will formally be moved into the ARV for the benefit of its creditors. Under the ARV, the Eskom creditors would own a majority stake in the new structure via debt for equity swap. The ARV will take control of all power plant operations, fuel procurement, and maintenance requirements and provide electricity to Eskom under long-term contracts still to be negotiated. Once Eskom creditors agree to the ARV, negotiations will be held with the South African Treasury and other financial institutions, which will be required to provide financial guarantees to support all contractual structures and other ancillary contracts. What I've just described is the practice of predatory lending. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have been doing this for years to keep emerging economies in debt. They would demand structural adjustment programs as a condition for loans, often to governments who see these loans as a last resort, exerting undue influence over their central banks and pressurizing them to privatize the major state-owned enterprises. What is currently happening to Eskom is the end result of these predatory lending practices. Eskom is now being pushed into insolvency, and Mr. De Beer and his massive team are aiding the collection process. The founder of the Activist Network Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt wrote, "The World Bank and the IMF have systematically made loans to states as a means of influencing their policies." Today's principal reform measure driven by international finance is to push countries towards a net zero economy. During the COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, in 2021, South Africa's President, Cyril Ramaphosa, would sign the Just Energy Transition Agreement with the USA, Germany, Great Britain and the European Union to move away from coal and towards a net zero economy.
Today, as part of this commitment, the United States, together with the UK, France, Germany and the EU, is announcing a new partnership with South Africa to help transform their economy to a clean energy economy more quickly. Right now, South Africa is the largest emitter in Africa, due in large part to the heavy reliance on coal for power. By closing South Africa's coal plants ahead of schedule and investing in clean power alternatives for the people of South Africa, and supporting an equitable, inclusive transition in South Africa's coal sector, we're following through on the pledge the G7 partners made in Cornwall to accelerate the transition away from coal in developing countries.
As a result of this agreement, the bankrupt Eskom would initially be given loans to the value of $8.5 billion to help them transition to a net zero. However, it is estimated that Eskom would require another R1.5 trillion between 2023 and 2027 to transition away from coal fully. Imagine that. Eskom is about to be declared bankrupt, but the bankers have so much faith in the utility that they are thinking of increasing the utility's current debt from R400 billion to R1.9 trillion. Awesome. Would you agree? While such a radical transition in the electricity sector has never been achieved anywhere in this world, by signing the International Just Energy Partnership, Ramaphosa, in November of 2021, tied South Africans to the following undertaking. According to Ramaphosa, the partnership aims to accelerate the decarbonization of South Africa's economy, with a focus on the electricity system, to help it achieve the ambitious goals set out in its updated nationally determined contribution emissions goals. The resolution established a task force to help determine targets within the country's nationally determined contribution to the accelerated decarbonization of South Africa's electricity system. According to the Just Energy Transition Office fact sheet, this decarbonization plan looks as follows. Eskom will decommission 10 of its 13 coal-fired power stations by 2040 and 2050. In the process, Eskom plans to decommission 5,400 megawatts of electricity by 2022, 10,500 megawatts by 2030, and 35,000 megawatts by 2050. This means that Eskom plans to decommission 93% of its coal-fired plants over the next 28 years, keeping in mind that the current installed capacity is 37,698 megawatts. time constraints prevent us from fully explaining the reasoning behind this Just Energy Transition Partnership and the Net Zero Plan. However, this plan is meticulously outlined in Bill Gates's book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the Solutions We Have and the Breakthroughs We Need. According to Gates, the world needs to get to zero carbon emissions by 2050. As I argue in the book, accomplishing that will require a green industrial revolution in which we decarbonize virtually the entire physical economy, how we make things, generate electricity, move around, grow food, and cool and heat buildings. The action plan to end load shedding, announced by Cyril Ramaphosa on July 25, 2022, is developed around the ideas in Gates's book and aimed at rolling out the JETP. How much do Mr. De Beer and his advisors understand about this plan? The following clip is from an interview on SABC by Mr. De Beer's energy expert David Lipschitz. Mr. Lipschitz is being asked what can be done to end load shedding. Listen carefully to his answer.
The government's saying that we're going to declare a state of disaster. If we already had strategies in place that would allow for decentralization, that would allow for rooftop PV, that would allow for embedded batteries in shopping centers and private houses and companies and so on, then I would say maybe it would help. But I don't see how declaring a state of disaster is going to help when what it's going to do is it's going to concentrate government decision-making into fewer and fewer people. And we know that when that happens, corruption rockets. And that worries me. But the fact of the matter is that every single person who has electricity now, whether they're in Bishop's Court or they're in Khayelitsha or in Houghton or Soweto, who has a roof, has the opportunity to interact with the grid and buy and sell electricity from the grid. And that can happen today, and it can happen in a very big way. So we need this mesh of everything coming together, and we need Minister Mantashe and President Ramaphosa to come to the table and say, wow, look what countries like Vietnam did in a year, let's do that here. And I think that we can make a difference really quickly. If we continue with a centrist approach, with government wanting to be responsible for everything, I think we're going to have load shedding for a long time to come.
If you understand the Eskom agenda, then what Mr. Lipschitz says will make sense. Mr. Lipschitz is describing the rollout of the JETP. There are two takeaways from the Lipschitz interview. Firstly, he spoke about moving away from a centrist approach to energy supply. He gives the impression that by declaring a state of disaster, the ANC will usurp all power over Eskom, concentrating decision-making in the hands of fewer people. He, of course, omits to say that their plan would achieve the same by placing the power over Eskom in the hands of their lobbyists. But I digress. Secondly, he talks about moving towards a mesh of everything coming together so that everyone can interact with the grid. What Mr. Lipschitz just described when he suggested that government move away from a centrist approach to a decentralized energy system is what is commonly referred to as the smart energy grid. Limited time prevents us from fully explaining this in detail, but I will give a brief introduction here. According to the Deputy Director General for Clean Energy, Mokgadi Modiz, as the fourth industrial revolution approaches, South Africa needs to move with speed to intensify the deployment of smart grids. Sustainable Development Goal 7 of Agenda 2030 calls for a decarbonized power sector with a significant quantum of renewable sources at the core of the transition to a sustainable energy future. Renewable energy and energy efficiency are the main pillars of the energy transition. Together they can provide over 90% of the energy-related CO2 emission reductions that are required. The aim of removing Eskom's control is to transform the traditional energy grid into a smart energy grid. According to the World Economic Forum, today's energy grid structure is unsustainable. It offers limited flexibility or openness to support emerging renewable technologies. Traditional energy grids support a one-way flow of power from centralized sources, such as coal, nuclear and gas, to points of consumption, homes, businesses and data centers. When more power is needed, another centralized source of generation, a power plant, has to be built. The traditional grid cannot quickly pivot in the face of acute demand spikes or support the 100% renewable energy critical to meet global climate goals. In a traditional energy grid, power flows from a centralized source like a power plant to points of consumption. When more power is needed, a new plant has to be built. Traditional energy grids have worked well for decades, but climate change and energy stresses mean they need a rethink. They continue. According to the International Energy Agency, investment in electricity grids must average around $600 billion annually through 2030 for the global energy sector to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. That means that innovation will take a host of public and private organizations, advancing collaboratively towards common energy goals. In Europe, this vision is already underway. The Edge for Smart Secondary Substation Alliance, E4S, is a partnership of 8 major electric utilities providers that Intel and other companies are working with to develop a smart grid. However, these so-called decentralized smart grid energy systems will be far from decentralized. They will all run on blockchain technology. With the blockchain, every single transaction will be recorded, vis-a-vis these smart cities being called blockchain cities. Finally, do you really think that the global planners would leave this technology in the hands of the ANC and Eskom when the end goal is the creation of a surveillance society? No, I don't think so. They have been proposing these smart energy grids at least since 2015. In 2015, the Gordon Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria published a report titled Smart Cities and Smart Grids, A Vision for South Africa. In their report, they already outlined how Eskom should be privatized and unbundled. The report spoke about transforming the traditional grid into a smart grid organization. However, smart cities have been rolled out in South Africa for much longer. Century City in Cape Town has been a smart city since 2013. Waterfall City in the north of Johannesburg, financed by the Waterfall Investment Company, and Century City are early examples of smart cities being rolled out across the country. However, as we speak, smart city infrastructure is being rolled out across the country. If you have seen contractors digging up roads in your area, the chances are that they are busy installing smart infrastructure. Don't be fooled by these sensation-seeking YouTube videos claiming that Ramaphosa's smart city dream is in tatters. Smart cities in South Africa are alive and well. There is one final issue. After we recorded this podcast and while we were busy with the video editing, a newspaper report surfaced that the ANC called for the declaration of a state of disaster over the Eskom crisis. The article in the Independent Online read that South Africa's ruling party, the ANC, has directed the government to declare a national state of disaster at the struggling power utility Eskom in a bid to end the ongoing energy crisis. What a coincidence this would be. In our Friday, January 13th podcast, we predicted this would happen. How did we know this? We knew this because the Rothschild asset, KW Miller, called for it. In EIN Press Wire of October 31st, 2022, CIO advisors of Mr. Miller declared a state of emergency in the South African energy sector. The Rothschild lapdog, Cyril Ramaphosa, only does what his master instructs him to do. Why does Rothschild want the electricity sector declared a national state of disaster or emergency? Because according to the narrative constructed by Miller and his team, Eskom management and operations staff is not competent to manage the pending electricity catastrophe. Eskom must be immediately ring-fenced, triaged, and brought under the control of a new, hands-on, senior energy chief restructuring officer and a new independent senior energy executive management team. Eskom operations and maintenance contracts are wrought with fraud, incompetence and outright theft of critical equipment. Eskom coal and diesel fuel contracts and procurement are wrought with fraud, kickbacks and outright theft. They have also constructed the false narrative that substandard coal has been fed into the Eskom coal fleet for years, virtually destroying the coal plant boilers and other equipment. As we will show in a future podcast, this is not supposed to happen since there are specific protocols to test the coal that ends up in the boilers. Eskom is supposed to work closely with the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research to ensure that only good quality coal is used. If poor quality coal is destroying the boilers, then Andre de Ruyter must be personally held responsible. The truth about the state of disaster is that it is being declared to protect the newly acquired asset of the Rothschilds. It is not being declared to protect Eskom, a public utility belonging to the people of South Africa. Neil de Beer is not working in the interest of the South African people. He is serving the interest of the mineral energy complex. On Saturday night, while busy doing the final editing on this video, a friend sent me a video of KW Miller titled, ANC to suspend SA Constitution, and wanted to know what now. The short answer is that this changes nothing because Eskom will still end up in the ARV that Mr. Miller proposes. It now becomes critically important you keep your eye on the ball and not play the man. I know this sounds boring, but start to follow the accounting and legal battles because that is where the real action is. Before I end, I want to share the following thoughts with the listeners. The idea for this podcast came last Sunday, January 29th. At first, I was unsure if I wanted to produce this podcast since I know two of the politicians currently working with Mr. De Beer. But I know them both as honorable men who love this country and would never deliberately cause its people harm. I have never sensed a hint of malice during my limited encounters with them. Furthermore, I don't think they are doing this for financial gain. Like so many others, I think they have been misled and honestly believe this is the only way to save Eskom. In light hereof, I want to appeal to them that they reconsider their association with Mr. De Beer. I want them to consider this. Professor Samson Mamfweli, Director of the Center for Renewable and Sustainable Energy Studies at Stellenbosch University, warns that opening up the electricity supply market could lead to a death spiral of the power utility. According to Samson, the president's plan has basically opened the energy or electricity supply market, and they are now working on the revised integrated plan. Eskom has got a straightforward procedure, so it is now becoming easier for people to buy electricity from IPPs and to produce their own electricity. Samson goes on to state as follows: while that's a good thing, it could lead to a death spiral for Eskom because all the people and industries doing this are those who could afford to pay for the electricity, so it'll be left with customers who can't afford high electricity prices and those who are basically not paying. This action could lead to the end of Eskom and the collapse of the entire South African society. As coal mines and power plants start shutting down in Mpumalanga, and with the economic multiplier effect, one could see the collapse of the province's entire economy within a few short years. The rest of South Africa will not be isolated from such effects. There is no future scenario with a positive outcome. Collapse is the inevitable and only result. So, please, reconsider. If you have not seen our podcast, The Great Eskom Heist, I want to encourage you to watch it because this video will make little sense unless you do so. If you like the Russell Report's content, please like our videos, subscribe and share it.